First of all, thank you for coming in to the last track on the last day of the event. I appreciate your persistence and your interest. When we designed this track, the intent was to do something that other climate tracks, other events had not done. I think everyone has seen the magic graph of the IPCC, and the question always comes up, what are you going to do about it? And you can't solve old problems with old ideas. So in the past couple of months, these two gentlemen over here, if you could come up, Po Bronson and Arvind Gupta from Mayfield and SOSV, have successfully managed to screw up my brain and my thinking. So I thought, why not do the same for everybody else? And so with that, I also want to mention that they're co-authors of a very interesting book called Decoding the World, which I highly recommend. And with that, I'm going to hand over to them, and let's see what happens.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you very much for having us here. No small throwdown to challenge your mind. What was it? Challenge our minds?
Screw up your mind.
Screw up your mind. I'm just trying to make sure I get past challenge, not a way to blow up, but screw up. So that's our bar.
Rewire.
Rewire. Let's do that.
I think rewire would work.
So why are we here? So we're here because Arvind Gupta was the founder of IndieBio at the venture capital firm SOSV. And 5 years ago, I came in to do the podcast. We hit it off. We became best friends. We wrote a book together. I was working for Arvind at the time. 2.5 years ago, you moved to Mayfield on Sand Hill Road.
Correct.
And I was handed the keys to IndieBio. And you've gone on to do these great human, but also importantly, climate tech, planetary health companies at Mayfield, a couple of which I've had the joy of participating in those rounds. And but the proliferation of companies that we've done and the number of spaces that we're in is collectively often ranked as the number one most active climate tech package in the world, which doesn't mean we're the best, doesn't mean the biggest returns. It means that the role played in the VC, you are.
No, might be.
Might be. No, but but what it does mean is that we're for all the climate tech VCs that you see in the world, every single one of them has got 1 to 7 companies in climate tech out of IndieBio. IndieBio that Arvind created, and then 5 years later, I've been managing for him. He handed me the keys to the Ferrari and said, drive it. And that's what we have.
That's right.
And that adds up to perhaps 80 or 90 climate tech companies that either together both of us have done. And it's that proliferation of doing companies that we learn off of. Everything we invest in, we learn more than you would if you just studied it. And so we're here to talk about some of the extracted learnings from that.
Yeah, thank you. And really, Po runs IndieBio because I knew he could make it far greater than I ever could. And what he, the way he thinks and the way he can bring people together and is just on another level. You don't know that yet, but you will, and it's going to be glorious. But in the meantime, one of the things that we decided to do was write a book that explains some of the things that we were seeing through experience and doing through experience rather than studying through theory. And the world has studied plenty through theory, but how do we actually solve these problems through capitalism? How do we solve these problems through businesses that rely on actual demand, actual physics of cash flows, supporting the solutions to actually drive change? And that's really
let's put some structure on this. So we're not going to tell you how we're going to solve the climate today. We're going to tell you our part in it, which is how can venture capital back some startups that become world-class companies that play a part of that. So we're going to talk about funding climate tech companies and what it takes to make them great. So in our atmosphere today, this milieu, and you've seen many of them up and down the valley and around the world. You heard from Manu some of the numbers of how much money is being poured into climate tech, and people are always like wondering, what's the next great climate tech idea? Or if I did this, would it get funded? And so we see in our environment, we do see a lot of what we'd call crowded spaces. And where there's tons of startups in a space, and we like to say, there's always a better one next week. So hydrogen production is one of these, where every week there's another advancement and reduction in process. You could fund a company, and next week it could be no longer the best one in the world. There's a whole class of companies that we say will never, can't beat physics, right?
Yes, we can. It'll never beat the physics of actually being able to make money.
Yeah, they're impossible, but they're labeled as climate tech, and maybe they kind of fudge their techno-economic models and paint a rosy picture,
ain't gonna
but they're
happen.
never going to beat physics. Then there's a class of companies you might say we could call playing the lottery. One of them might win, and the others we hope are TBAs, to be aggregated. In every market, you might fill it up with 100 or 200 companies. One is going to win, maybe 5 will win, some will get bought, others will go out of business. And it kind of feels like playing the lottery with those. And people feel that way about cell-based meats, which is something you started. We don't think we're playing the lottery, but they feel that way about it. Fusion can be that, like your fusion company might hit, the other ones might not. There's a lot of markets like that. What they have in common is they are focused on a process and making the most efficient process and trying to win through technological process. And one of our big messages today is they're not thinking hard enough about product. What is the product and what is the business model? And how do you anchor a company and design the company itself from its technology through its business model so the company is a great product in an economic marketplace. So shed some light on the rules of making a great product or observations and stories.
Well, let's start with the very best sustainability companies. By definition, in the long run, will also be the very best product companies. So I think that's the most important thing if you don't believe that, then the rest doesn't matter, right? So you have to believe, and you could look around right now and see how a great product could actually spark a revolution in an industry. And Tesla will be an overused example, but it's a good one, of a good product that does not sell by catering to the sustainability aspect of it to its customers. Is just a fun, faster, better car. That's the value proposition. So how do you start focusing on products so all of our sectors could be disrupted the same way our car industry is getting disrupted? I think that is the thing to really think about. And so you can start by looking at what makes these great companies when they're mature, and then work backwards to make sure you instill the seeds of what the company could become one day with that in mind.
I think the audience wants some more examples to illustrate some of these concepts where you really aren't competing on you're winning on sustainability, but that's not the feature you're selling into on.
That's right.
And so we're just going to go back and forth and give some examples. I'll start with one. So this is kind of idiosyncratic because at IndieBio we do a lot of companies, so we go into every little niche market in the world. So one is cosmetics. Mm-hmm. No one's saying cosmetics are ruining the world, right? But if you can make that more sustainable, you've made yet another industry sustainable. So we just did a $11 million financing to Geltor. Geltor makes animal-free cosmetic products that are much more sustainable. But it's not just a replacement, because once you're making these recombinant proteins and you're doing it in a sustainable way, and you're not sourcing them from livestock or jellyfish or seafood, You can also do human collagen, human keratin, specifically amino acid sequence and truncates that work on human skin way better than smearing pigs on your face or smearing jellyfish juice on your face. And so you have a far better product that's crushing other products on the market in its performance data as a cosmetic that's also happens to be way more sustainable. So that's one for me.
All right.
You got to take it. There you go. Beat that one.
Oh, geez.
That was a pretty low bar.
Let's see. Oh, the bees.
Yeah, here we go.
The bees. Well, bees are sustainable, right?
Everybody loves bees.
Everyone loves bees. We have an entire chapter on bees in the book. We'll throw a plug in there. So bees are great. They are required to pollinate a lot of the fruit we eat. 75% of the groceries in our grocery markets require bees. Bees, if you could help them be better, directly will be related to less water use, more fruit, more food. Immediately, you are getting this huge benefit by helping nature's friend, the bees. So there's this company called BeeFlow that has invented a feed additive that, all natural, organic, fortifies their immune system. But there was this interesting byproduct they saw. That was the initial insight. When they started doing pollination trials, these bees would actually fly further and fly longer, which meant more flowers, which meant more pollination, which meant more yield for the crop. And they then doubled down on this and started to train these bees neurologically by showing them the exact flowers to go after. And so there's this entire field, this entire approach they're driving to create much more sustainable produce, but not by reducing water, but actually increasing yield through helping bees get better. All right.
Well, one of the secrets is that like people think of a bee pollinating a flower as sort of, it helps the flower propagate, so it's sort of like a sexual act. That's a one-time thing. It's not a one-time thing. It turns out that the more often a bee visits a flower, the bigger the crop is going to be. And it turns out to be one of the few variables a farmer has to control their agricultural crop size. Of almonds, of blueberries, raspberries, avocados, and the like, kiwi. So by them deciphering the scent molecules coming off flowers and knowing which ones train bees where to go, they increase the number of times a bee visits a flower, and they make blueberries the size of golf balls. Like, it's incredible, and it's saving the bees. And they're also introducing non-American honeybee species because we have a monoculture of bees, but it's a better product with creating better produce for the farmers to make more money. And you're helping the farmers make more money. They're not paying a tax to deal with the sustainability problems. So you have a great example there. Tell us about windfall, which took, say, for a dairy farmer, which the methane coming off a dairy barn was a tax. And here in California, we've passed these laws, and the dairy farmers are leaving the state and getting frustrated because they have to reduce their methane. How do you solve a problem by helping them not just not have to pay that tax, but make money?
Yeah, I think this is really an important issue, especially if you're building a business and you want it to thrive in an uncertain future. Let's say you've invented a technique for reducing methane emissions from dairy. How are you going to go ahead and build a big business out of that? Well, that's what a friend of mine, Josh Silverman, and the founder of Windfall had done. He invented a way by discovering this consortium of methanotrophs to convert methane and reduce it and eliminate that methane exhaust from the atmosphere. So the next question is, what should the business be? How do you make a business out of that? You could sell carbon credits. For every ton of methane removed, there's a CO2 equivalent, and you could.
That's what most people would do. That's the company most people would make.
It's the exact obvious thing to do. The problem with that is taxes will never, ever create a history-making company, nor will it solve the problem. Because to truly solve the problem of climate, the tax would be north of 25% of the world GDP, and no one's going to do that. So therefore, it'll always be window dressing, if that is true. Okay, so we've thrown that out. Well, now how do we make a business out of this? Well, who's incentivized? Who has the problem? Farmers have a problem, methane, but they have another problem. They want to grow food. Now, methanotrophs, when they eat methane, they also do something else. They are able to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and incorporate that nitrogen into its own amino acids. And that is fertilizer. So when you think about it, we could take a very simple plastic box, have some of these methanotrophs, waft the dilute methane over it, and simply with time, end up with high-grade organic fertilizer. That farmers want and will pay a lot of money for, $800 a ton or more. So Windfall was created to be able to serve farmers that. So that's an example of thinking through.
Right. Or they can sell it to other farms
exactly.
as fertilizer.
That's right. So you're able to take a waste product, methane, which is actually really harmful, and turn that into a really beneficial product, which is fertilizer that the world needs, wants, and has a short supply of.
Possibly a better fertilizer than is existing. Not only is it a carbon-free fertilizer and all that, but it's works better.
Yeah, it's a living fertilizer, but we won't get into that.
We're not going to get into. Manu thinks he wants us to get into that. But what are you hearing? First of all, you're hearing that the role of venture is not just to fund people doing something. I don't think Arvind wants to publicly say this, so I'm just going to say it as his best friend. He really wanted to move to next stages, still early, but next stages like Series Seed and Series A investing, and help companies at that stage, because he had done it for 5 years at the really early stage before that. And we talk every night, and he meets a lot of companies, and he feels that a lot of them, even by Series A, are broken. Hard to imagine. Like a company usually by Series A is just figuring things out. It has a chance to pivot. It can move around. It can figure things out. And in software, you could do that. You could pivot fast. We tried to build a tool set where, even though we might be using biology and chemistry to solve climate problems, because we are definitely doing transformation of matter, we could also still pivot. But it's not the same as software. So when a company kind of gets wired, and it's wired at the wrong target, you end up with potentially could have been a great climate tech company, and now it's just a good one that probably, by our judgment, won't turn into the kind of venture capital returns we're all really looking for. And that the work of a VC in this stage is not just to give people money, but it is to work with the founders to re-aim the company and to make sure you have the best people in the world to go after that target. And that kind of lift and that work and that persuasion is a lot of what we do. Even at IndieBio, where we just get raw scientists out of labs emailing us, writing us, applying to us, we're always trying to brainstorm with them, how can we take your core tech and make a really world-class company out of it? And it is that idea set that deeply matters to the future success of a company. That is, again, not just about the process and the physics of the process, that will drive winning. The business model and the product will drive winning.
I think thank you for saying that. It is true, the job of a good venture capitalist is really, the check is the smallest part, right? It's being a thought partner. It's not being the CEO either. There is a CEO for a reason, right? And it's being a thought partner to the CEO and to the leadership team to figure out what is the best way to build the most value for the world. And in a climate tech company, that means removing as much CO2 or removing as much carbon footprint from a current product as possible while still being able to drive returns that the company can use as profits to grow, expand, and develop new products with, which means getting certain margin structures and all that kind of stuff. So if that's not there in the beginning, why is it hard? Because it's too expensive to pivot a moving atoms business, right? When you're moving electrons around, it's really easy to pivot. If you're building boxes and infrastructure, forget it, right? There's no pivot. So if you don't get it right the first time, you could have doomed a really good idea. And so that's the thing that I find tragic, to be honest, and why a lot of time and effort needs to be spent early on. And what is the destination we want to get to that creates massive returns? How do you design that in from the beginning and turn this into an execution game where your biggest assumptions are known and you're really testing those assumptions along the way? So
now one of the things you said, and you mentioned this when you're talking about windfall, which I think the whole audience, and especially people tuning in, understand now as taking a problem, a tax, and turning it into profitable revenue. That's a good company. Mm-hmm. But in that process, you also said, let's talk about carbon credits. Okay, so in climate tech, if you sit where we sit and you're seeing 1,000 startups a year, and many of you too are looking and thinking like this, the carbon credits are ubiquitous.
Yeah.
All right, and I would say let's just try to be a little more precise. So first, a carbon credit is actually what a polluter gets. A polluter who has a right to pollute gets a certain amount of credits, and if they don't use them all, they can sell them. You hear these things of Stripe and Microsoft are paying $200 a ton for CO2 and stuff like that. That's not a carbon credit. Carbon credit sells for about $3.86 for a ton. And that's a $15 billion trading market, right, which may not be sustainable in and of itself, but that's actually where all the volume is. Then you have, at the other end of the spectrum, with several in between, is the luxury premium carbon, what we call a carbon credit, but people tend to use CDR, where you're doing carbon sequestration, and you can get this sort of $100, $120, $150, $200 a ton, higher than the 45Q credit by a long shot. And those are ones that are attracting all of this attention and setting price bars, but they're actually a very, very small market. I'm trying to remember right now what the volume was last year in those, but it's small, compared to the 15 billion of the carbon credits.
I think it was 1 billion. Voluntary?
No, I think the CDR market was much smaller than a billion.
Oh, the CDR.
CDR.
Actually,
CDR like 80 billion.
Yeah.
Or 80 million.
Yeah. Actually spent.
And all that's future contracts.
Spent. Absolutely.
Actually delivered is probably like 3 million.
That's right.
And so it's tricky. I don't know if I'm going to put a provocative. You may never do a CDR company because you don't like it. At the rate, at IndieBio, we do companies where they're going to be in there.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn from them. I've got a fabulous one I like. I'll tell you about it. But
the Bayou?
Yeah. So you've heard of bioreactors, and you can grow microbes in bioreactors and stuff like that. I have the people who are owning all of the submerged bioreactor space, which is a bioreactor underwater, growing underwater. These are extremely cheap, inexpensive bioreactors that cost about $40 to make, and you sink them, and they grow your microorganism, and then they do good stuff for you in the wild. So we're operating in the Louisiana Bayou, and we're essentially getting paid. We're not doing carbon credit work. We are, but I'll explain that in a second. We're getting paid to go out there to fix the hypoxic dead zones. We're doing remediation. What's coming down the Mississippi is a lot of that fertilizer we were talking about. Algae eat it. They grow super fast. They outcompete everything. They suck up all of the oxygen, and a fish or a manatee or a dolphin comes along and hits this dead zone where there's no oxygen, and they immediately suffocate and die within minutes. And this is happening en masse, where the coasts of Florida are just having these dolphins, these manatees, and these fish just float ashore. And it's a horrible situation. So we can fix that by in our bioreactor submerged growing a diatom, which is a type of
Plankton.
Plankton, yeah. And then here's the cool thing. Meanwhile, in what it's doing, there's always this question, how are we ever going to decarbonize the oceans? Because they're way out there, right? How are we going to get out there and do it and pay for all that? Well, conveniently, tides have existed as long as we've been on the planet, and tides bring that water in, and then they flush it back out again. So we can use that in like 20-foot waters. The tides bring in the water. We the shells are made. We decarbonize that water, and then the tides take it back out to the ocean. So we're using like the Louisiana Bayou as essentially like a holding pen for ocean waters that we're constantly decarbonizing. And the shrimp trawlers that drop our submerged bioreactors into the water get some of the CDR revenue off of that. So it's a hybrid business model, and it's to be proven, but it's one of the kinds of things we're trying where we're never reliant on the CDR money, but it helps at least in the early years. Great. We'd love to hear your questions.
So why don't we just go ahead and move to questions and go from there? Because
I could just keep going.
And likewise. So, and we do this all day.
Yeah.
Like you can imagine. So
All right.
I'd like to hear what people are thinking about these days.
Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today. I was wondering about software technology in climate tech, and where do you see the players, and what's most interesting out there?
Man, there's software. Sorry, I'll let you jump on that.
No, you go.
So, software is where all VCs want to be because it's a much safer investment than investing in moving atoms. The margin structures are better. And it's what everyone knows. And so the flip side is it's very crowded. It's hard to know what wins. And so we're seeing software layers, I call them layers for a very specific reason, in the grid. We're seeing software layers. The most crowded software in all of climate is in carbon management for enterprises, right? So Watershed is one that Sequoia did. There's many, many more that will look at your inventory, look at your books, and then tell you the embodied footprint in your company. The hard part is how do you action that, right? So a lot of the softwares that we're seeing either are on the knowledge side, just knowing what's out there in terms of carbon footprint, or on the controller side. How do we control your house electrics, right? Or how do you control how a power generator is connecting to the grid or not? The question I have for the software companies is always the same, which is what makes your company the one that wins in the marketplace? Because it's a winner take all. You're going to have one software interface for that application, and so it becomes hard to understand how to answer that question very precisely. Now, every VC is going to have their process and all of that, but software is absolutely important and critical to all of this. And so we live in an electronic world. A software interface to the climate sector is going to be an important part.
I would say that the software is always going to help optimize your reduction across complex systems of resources, but it doesn't change the fundamental problem of the world's growing middle class moves from 1 billion people at a Western standard of living to 3 billion people in the next 20 years. And the amount of consumption that will happen means we need 3 or 4 Earths worth of natural resources if we keep doing things the way we're doing them. And software ain't going to solve that. So, and I can't compete on software, so I compete on the other stuff, on that transformation of matter. I do think a more interesting modern version of this question on software is what is the role of AI? And everyone wants to talk about the LLMs, so what's the role of those in this thing? And I do think that LLMs can provide some glue into understanding things such as original catalyst design for transformation matter to reach low energy states. They can inform that. But there are other AIs based on physics-based models that also can be extremely valuable in this space. And I would say virtually most of the companies have some element of an AI in them. That's part of what they're doing to make things efficient. It's like saying we run Microsoft Word at our company. Everybody does.
Right.
So is it the key thing? Maybe in some companies will an AI in the space actually be the difference maker.
Right. One way to think about it is software makes communication more efficient. That's what's driven trillions of dollars of value, human communication. We need to make everything else more efficient.
Well, just like, for example, California makes a lot of almonds, makes 80% of the world's almonds. During COVID, all of the tankers in Long Beach were lined up to get the almonds to take them back to Asia. And the ships at a certain point were like, look, it's only 6 days back to Asia. I ain't gonna wait around here. I'm just gonna go back empty, no almonds. So now California's got 1 billion pounds of almonds hanging out in warehouses and not sure what to do with them. Software isn't, the logistics of that, software could help, but ain't gonna, those almonds are gonna, go bad, unfortunately. So, next question.
For those of us who are living through the Climate Tech 2.0, tell us what segments are you, it's such a vast field to be mapped out. I mean, it's such a vast field. What segments, and I loved your examples of cosmetics and dairy, etc. But where are you seeing the ability for a VC to be a VC where it can make money, and what are the segments you're focused on?
I'm going to say I'm agnostic. I spent my life listening to people that the rest of the world overlooks, and I will always listen, and I'll find things that the rest of the world didn't listen to. And I have to be willing to listen, those sort of, read Decoding the World. I don't have a thesis, I have 1,000 theses, but really, I'll listen to anything. And so I try to be agnostic in order to keep my mind very open. And I don't really put boundaries on it because I say, I have a thesis that this is the way to do this thing. That's always predicated on what you know, and there's always someone that's disrupting what you know while you're forming that very thought in your head.
Yeah, don't hold back. I mean, I think, look, the only generalized principle is that you could make money from it profitably, sustainably, over time. And hopefully you have a moat too. And if you could do all of those things, the rest doesn't matter, right? So I wouldn't think of it as sectors or categories. That creates Me Too's. Yep. Think of it as problems with the ability to create sustained value from solving that problem.
Things like, in this market, it's more important that you're not a huge cash drain and that you can find a way to get to revenues and prove your product market fit earlier rather than that taking 7 or 10 years to get there. Things like that make sense. And then maybe tell them a little bit about your thinking around margins and some things like that, because that's important.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, how do you, to raise money, the VC is, what does the VC think? Oh, I'm going to give him X money and I'm hopefully going to receive 100X money back within 12 years. That's the entirety of the VC mind, right? That
sounds so simple.
And so then the calculations go on, right? Okay, how is this going to happen? Is this going to be a 10% gross margin business, which means there's zero hope of ever making money once your expenses are factored in? Is this a 90% gross margin business, which gives you a lot of room? Is this going to require $1 billion of capital to build a factory before you ever see $1 of revenue? So these are the things that go on. But, I think, I won't bore you with the entire stack of metrics, but if you'll find them yourself if you just answer the question, how do I sustainably get to a operating margin of, say, 20% consistently over 10 years? And if you could do that, it's a phenomenal business.
Your ventures are very impressive. So I have a question about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency apparently is a low-hanging fruit for carbon point of view and very fast returns, including heat pump for heating, cooling. And so are you guys looking into that, or are you guys involved in energy efficiency?
Your efficiencies. I mean, fast returns. I think the questions around efficiencies are always, okay, yes, everything will have to get more efficient, right? By definition, I agree with you. We're going to heat this or cool this room to 70 degrees, and it's either going to take, whatever, $1,000 of energy or $100 of energy. Well, $100 of energy is going to be better. Okay, fine. So, whether it's a heat pump or it goes back to how does the heat pump company make money and stay in business? Because yes, the efficiency is going to be what we want, but is it going to be better for a nuclear fusion reactor that could then just power cheaply an electric heater or electric cooler? Is it a heat pump? You see, so we don't know yet because those technologies haven't come online. So then you say, okay, well, is it a current technology like an HVAC system that's more efficient? Sure. So all of these are insertion points to build businesses. And in the end, it comes back to who's the customer and what business are you building. And I'm going to be a broken record. What's the margin structure of that business? So are you a service that can help make things more efficient?
Let me jump in here because, to survive as a startup is really hard. And I teach our startups this from day one. If you're 20% more efficient, you're dead. It's one thing if a big existing company can deliver a service 20%, and that's the thing. But if you're a startup doing 10, 20%, you're dead.
Yeah.
You have to be, from day one, the best in the world at something. And I work with my startups on the first day. You can be the fastest. You can be the longest. You can be the cheapest. You can be the most optimal. You got to be something to survive, because a startup lives in the world of ideas before it lives in the world of execution. And you can only make a process more efficient if you're big. You can only save the world climate if you're big. Our companies will only have an impact on the world when they're huge. But in the meantime, they live in the world of ideas, they inspire other people. You have to be front of mind of the next VC in line. And you better be the best at something. And again, it goes to aiming your company at the right direction. Figure that out and say, how can we be the best at some dimension? Because there are a lot of process companies. We turn this particular type of wet and heavy ag waste into this energy or this polymer and this thing, and it's all sustainable, and it's all kind of blah, unless you can say, we are the best at handling really wet biomass, or we are the fastest at this process. We convert it in 10 minutes when everyone else is taking 10 days, right? Have that singular dimension, and you have something to work with when you find that angle where you can be the best in the world from day one, at least the way you talk about it and think about it.
Thank you, Po. Again, the reason I work with Po, because that is the actual insight, right? The actual insight is, and I say this all the time, for me to invest in a company, the company has to be able to make history if it works and scales. That's the bar. So if you come in and pitch, we can make air conditioning 10% more efficient. Well, okay. That's the best you can do. We're probably going to fall short of that, so it's not going to be enough. But yeah, I think that's a good way to sort of look like we're wrapping. Finish a note on, which is, I think we need a lot more of that. And that's that kind of thinking, which is, how do you make history? How do you find a history-making problem and then be able to deploy a technology against solving it that is fundamentally a step change in what we had before, as opposed to an incremental change? Now is not the time for incremental innovation. If I'm going to put a provocative statement out there, that's what it would be. Now is the time for step change, radical innovation that it might be high risk, but that's okay. It's okay to take high risk. That's what's needed. So that's what I'm hoping everyone here is thinking about.
Thank you guys very much for listening. Thank you, appreciating. Enjoy the next panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.